I'm very pleased to welcome back to the program Jonathan Alter. We've spoken in the past. He has a new book out. It's called American Reckoning: Inside Trump's Trial and My Own. Jonathan was in the courtroom of Judge Merchan's trial for the defamation trial for E. Jean Carroll. He has been following this situation for a while. He's written about a number of American presidents. Jonathan, I've actually been reading his very best. You know, Jimmy Carter's been in the news lately. I thought it would be a good time to review and revisit your Jimmy Carter book, His Very Best, which always surprises me because I adopt the mythology, Carter wasn't a very good president, didn't accomplish very much. And I read that book and I'm like, no, that's not who he was. That's not who he was. Jonathan Alter is here to talk about his past writing and his current writing. Welcome, Jonathan. How are you?
I'm doing great, Joan. Thanks so much for having me. And I'm thrilled that you're reading my Jimmy Carter biography. I spent the better part of 5 years working on it and learned a lot of things.
I was talking about it at the beginning of the show today, and I was like, you think you remember about Jimmy Carter, but you don't. And there's a lot more that went on that you either didn't know in the first place or have since forgotten. It's really a wonderful book. I want to take you.
So I just wanted to urge you. I love that you're reading that book, but I really want to urge you to give my brand new book a try. It's coming out tomorrow. It does cover the defamation case, but the middle part of the book is about the Trump felony trial, where he was convicted on 34 counts, the first president ever convicted of a crime, making him a convicted felon. And that's really what most of this book is about, although there's a lot in the book about the stakes in this election.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that people buy it for somebody they know who, might be on the fence. I'm hoping it encourages people to go out and work really hard to make sure that this menace does not get back into the White House. It's got pretty much. I do have a
copy of the book. I do have a copy of the book. The new book, and I have been reading it, and I've been reading about the parts of the book. You kept a daily journal when you were in the courtroom, and that has been brought into the book, and it's interesting because it's informative. You observe all the things like a demeanor and tone that people would pay attention to if they were there. It's a perfect combination of informative and dishy. I like that. I like both of those things.
Thanks. Yeah, there's a lot of acerbic, barbed commentary by me. As I'm reacting to Trump in the courtroom, I'm sitting just a few feet away from the greatest threat to democracy in the history of our republic. And when I saw the jury foreperson say guilty, guilty 34 times, covered a lot of big stories in my life, Joan. The end of the Cold War, I was at ground zero. This was one of the most dramatic moments I've ever seen, and yet it was untelevised. So what I want to try to do, people think they know what happened in the trial. They really don't. There was so much that went on in that courtroom that was highly dramatic and compelling. But that's not the whole book. I've got a lot about Chicago in the book.
There's a whole... You start the book, for once, talking about yourself, which...
Yeah. This is the first... I'm glad you know. This is the first book that I've ever done where I write about myself. This is my sixth book. And I like to keep myself out of it normally, whether I'm writing about Jimmy Carter, Barack Obama, Franklin Roosevelt, keep myself out of it. But this is very much about, my, not very much, because it's really just about 30 pages in the book. But I talk about my growing up in this intensely political family in Chicago, and my late mother, Joanne Alter, became the first woman elected in Cook County in 1972. And I talk about her standing up to Mayor Daley and her long relationship with Daley. She knew the original Mayor Daley when they were young in the early 1950s. And I tell a story, Susie Essman, from Curb Your Enthusiasm. She, along with Stephen Colbert, was one of my blurbers on this book, and she said that the part she liked the most was the part about the women who have shaped my life, starting with my mother, others included. And the story really starts with Eleanor Roosevelt, of all people. In 1948, my mother was a student at Mount Holyoke College, and she gave Eleanor Roosevelt, the most famous woman in the world, a tour. And Eleanor said, "Now I want to see your dorm, where you live." And my mother couldn't believe that. I go over to her dorm, and Eleanor plops down on her bed and says, "Now, Joanne, you tell me all about yourself and how you want to make a better world." Oh. And my mother was this Jewish girl, from Chicago. Nobody in her family had gone to college. She couldn't believe the most famous woman in the world is asking about her. And so she basically took that sense of curiosity about other people and that interest in politics, and first she gave it to my father, and then she gave it to the four of us kids. And I think the reason I'm a journalist and interested in politics and have gone on to interview 9 American presidents, it all starts with Eleanor Roosevelt and my mother in 1948. And the story goes up to the 1952 Democratic Convention, where my parents are, getting married, working for Adlai Stevenson, and then I'm running around underfoot at the 1968 Democratic Convention, dodging, the violence, and so I talk about that and just try to give people a sense of why I felt like I needed to bear witness in this historic trial, because this is what I had been sort of preparing for since I was a little kid obsessed with Abraham Lincoln.
Well, at the part of the book, correct me. I read this a while ago, so correct me if I'm a little off here. But you go through a whole list of reasons why you felt you had to cover this trial, why it was important to you.
Yeah, I mean, so at that point, I'm talking about the crimes that Trump has committed, and there's a couple of things that happened to me earlier that I think were especially influential. So another thing that happened in Chicago is that when I was 8 years old, Martin Luther King came to our house. I got his autograph on my school-lined paper, and he had been living on the west side to draw attention to the problems in the north, particularly housing problems, and feuding with Mayor Daley. And so I developed a consciousness about race and social justice at a very young age, partly by reading people like Mike Royko and, falling in love with journalism and politics. And so I saw Trump as a kind of a threat to everything I believed in, really. And, I like to think of myself as an idealist without illusions, like JFK. That's the way he described himself. But I realized I did have some illusions about roughly half of the American public. And I felt like I needed to bear witness. Everybody has to do what they can, right? So I have a section in the book called We Do Our Part, which is the line that Franklin Roosevelt used. He had everybody during the Depression put a decal in their window. It had a blue eagle on it, and underneath it said, "We do our part." So for some people doing their part to protect democracy might be giving money to Democratic candidates. I can't do that, For other people, I'm a journalist, I can't give money. Other people, it might be, using the call tools that allow them to call in a battleground state, make like 25 calls a night to voters in other states where the computer does the calling. For me, I reflected back, strangely enough, on an interview that I did with Richard Nixon in 1988. I really wanted to meet Nixon before he croaked, so I made arrangements for him to come to Newsweek. And I asked him, how is history going to remember Ronald Reagan? And he said, well, you have to distinguish between history and the historians. Because the historians are, if you're a conservative, you go into business. If you're a liberal, you go into history or journalism. And I heard that, and I started thinking about this earlier this year when I was trying to decide whether to cover this trial or not. And I felt like Nixon, who was a really, he was a criminal president as well, but at least he respected the peaceful transfer of power, and he was not nearly as bad as Trump. Nixon had my number. I felt like seen by Richard Nixon. Like, all that I can bring to do my part is bearing witness, right? Mm-hmm. So I decided that I had to bear witness to this moment of accountability, this very dramatic
Well, you talk about that. I found it. It's the end of page 46, the beginning of page 47. I have to. Do I want to bring my life to a standstill for weeks or even months to cover this trial? In a funny way, it's not really up to me. I'm going to cover it because I have to. I'm compelled to.
Yeah, that was my feeling as I went into this, and then I'm not always a very good advanced planner, but in this case, I did.
Yeah, talk about how you got that seat, mister.
Yeah. So, I have a Substack newsletter called Old Goats, and I was writing articles about the January 6th committee hearings last year, and actually 2022, and they were published in the Washington Monthly, the place I originally started. So I got the Washington Monthly to have me represent them at this trial, and it was only one seat per news organization. So every other news organization, had many people who wanted to cover the trial, and they would have to rotate in and out, it'd be in the overflow room, and I was one of the only people who, because there was nobody else from the Washington Monthly, I was in there every day. And then when the New York Times opinion section found out I had a permanent seat in the courtroom, they hired me. I'd written for them some over the years to write short pieces for the New York Times, and I did about 40 of them. And I like those pieces, but they just barely scratched the surface of how dramatic this trial was. And
give us an example of that, something that we would never have known from the news reports.
Well, you might have known some of the headlines, but like, for instance, when Trump was held in contempt of court 10 times, you might have. That wasn't even the top story of the day. Imagine any other president being held in contempt of court, and people, oh, yeah, I guess I heard that. I mean, the judge was saying, I'm sending you to jail, Mr. Trump, if you reoffend. And so Trump didn't. He didn't want to go into this little cell in, this bonfire of the vanity-style courthouse, So he cleaned up his act. And another time, Trump only had one witness, and the witness was acting from the witness stand. He was acting as if he was the judge. He was saying things like, strike that, And so the judge did something that lawyers had never seen in like 50 years of practice. He ordered, clear the courtroom. And it was bedlam in the court. So, I mean, did you get a sense that this was, I mean, this was high drama, and then, of course, with the verdict, when you see the jury foreperson, just a few feet away, go guilty, guilty, guilty 34 times, and then Trump, as he's walking out just 2 feet from me, he looks like he's been hit in the solar plexus, and then he's just like bent over in pain, and then of course he straightens up and puts on his game face, comes out, denounces the judge and everything, denounces the verdict in front of the cameras. But there was a lot that we saw that wasn't televised, and I try to paint word pictures of what I I saw, and this is. I was very grateful to Lawrence O'Donnell, because in his blurb and then on his show, last week, he was saying that it was better to have me there than cameras, because I gave people like a fuller picture of what was really going on, and so I wanted to get at that, and then also at how Nancy Pelosi maneuvered Joe Biden off the ticket. I have all this fresh reporting in this book about how that happened. So mostly I wanted to give people a sense of what it felt like to be alive in the Trump era, and how hard it is really emotionally, for a lot of people. And also a sense that, this New York jury ruled, and now what I call the big jury is out deliberating. The big jury is the electorate. And I feel the same sense of nervousness that I felt when we were waiting for the jury to come back and deliver their verdict. Fortunately, this one doesn't have to be unanimous, but it's whether they will do their duty as citizens and protect our democracy. And the jurors in the New York case did. There was a mountain of evidence against Trump, and they found him guilty on 34 counts. And in this case,
that's one of the things that I've been talking about, and I think Charlie Sykes wrote about it a couple of weeks ago. Forget for 1 second, just forget about Trump and Kamala Harris. What will this election say about us as Americans? What will this say about who we are? And I think that gets to the heart of it. I mean, forget if, we know with the Electoral College things can be crazy, but if for some strange reason Trump gets a lot of the popular vote, what does that say about us as a people, that someone who is a liar and a grifter and a con man and an adjudicated rapist and a felon and on and on and on is a lot of people's choice to be commander-in-chief? What does that say about us, Jonathan?
This is the big question, and it's a reckoning for the American people. That's why I call the book American Reckoning, and I write exactly what Charlie said, that this is a defining election, not just in terms of the damage that Trump would do to our democracy and in a lot of other areas if he wins, but it says something about who we are as a people. And it's going to be a close election. There's no getting around that. But it makes a huge difference what the outcome is. In other words, yes, if he loses but gets millions of votes, all right, he's an effective demagogue. He's an effective con man. But at least we didn't make a decision that said that at the end of the day, we don't care about whether we have fascism or democracy. Now, I didn't used to use that word fascism, Joan, but the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, by the way, Trump lied on this, he didn't fire Milley. Milley's term ended. Right? He didn't fire these other people. They left, the people who denounced him as a threat. General Milley said Donald Trump is a fascist to the core. And then on another occasion called him a wannabe dictator. These other people who work closely with him said he was dangerous. The American people have to listen to this, or they're not protecting our sacred tradition as a free people. Yeah. And this is what so here's I bring it home. I talk about at the very beginning of the book. I talk about my late father, who lived in Chicago his whole life, and George H.W. Bush, and they both enlisted during World War II. My father was shot down over Europe. Bush was shot down in the Pacific. And they both explicitly went and risked their lives for an idea, democracy, to protect democracy. That's why they went. So if they could risk their lives, how about us? Least we could do is like call into battleground states and try to convince people to get off the couch.
That's one of the things that I've observed as well, and that hurts me. I know that there are a lot of people who are alive today who weren't born, during World War II or weren't born close enough to it to remember it. And I know we are always accused of forgetting history, but I can't imagine the post-World War II America ever voting anybody like Donald Trump anywhere close to the presidency. And I think to myself, how did we lose that so quickly? Well, I think historians will wrestle over this for a long time, but it's true that, like George Wallace, by the way, his racism was not as explicit as Trump's. He used more code words when he ran for president 3 times. So when he was running in Alabama, he was more outwardly racist. But, he didn't come close to winning the presidency. Joe McCarthy never came close to winning the presidency. Huey Long was a demagogue from the left. He was assassinated, but probably wouldn't have beaten Roosevelt. So we have never had this before. We have had a crooked president, Richard Nixon, but we've never had anything like this before, and this is why the stakes are so immense. And so I think I come back to this story in the book about Franklin Roosevelt and the decal. You've heard this, right? Where in 1933 he got legislation through, and they had a decal that people put in their windows, in their store windows and in homes, and it had a blue eagle on it, and underneath it said, "We do our part." And so the question for all of us, in that case it was, we do our part to fight the Depression. But the question for all of us is, will we do our part to defend democracy? And I hope the answer to that question is yes. I guess we're going to have to wait for a few weeks to get a definitive answer on that. Jonathan, your book, American Reckoning, is wonderful. It's called Inside Trump's Trial and My Own. And I also still really want to tell you about his very best, the book that Jonathan wrote on Jimmy Carter, because it's awesome, too. Jonathan, thank you so much for sharing with us today. Thanks so much, John. I really appreciate it. Anytime.